Yeah, like Daniel says, my name is James Taylor. I'm from Australia. I've been working as a travel journalist for about a decade now, I think. I just wanted to start off by telling you a little bit about how I got into the world of travel writing. I was living in Iceland some years ago, which is a story in of itself, and I was working down at the docks, unloading boats worth of fish that had come in to the docks. And in my free time, I was doing travel around Iceland, renting out camper vans, traveling around a bit. And then I had always kind of been a little bit interested in the world of travel writing. I remember, you know, one of my first family trips, we went to Turkey. We had a Lonely Planet guide, and I was just like fascinated. I was just like, wow, you can get paid to write these Lonely Planet guides. I was just like, I want to do this. And so in Iceland, for about my travels, I would just start writing little stories about the places I was going, the things I was seeing and doing. And then one day on a break, while I was at work, I decided to send one of the stories to at the time, there was this airline called Wow Air. They were an Icelandic budget airline. And they had a magazine, and I sent an email to their editor with a story. And I just kind of said, like, hey, like I did this trip. I wrote this story about this place in Iceland. Maybe you'd think about publishing it. It was very unprofessional, very kind of, I'm new at this. I don't think the story was very good even, but the editor got back to me within 10 minutes saying like, hey, yeah, I really like this. We can only pay you, we only pay a little bit. We're a budget airline. It might not be as much as you're used to. And she offered me about 300 euros for this story. And I was just kind of like, whoa, okay, that's quite a lot of money for this story. And at that point, it kind of clicked that I could potentially start doing this full time. So over time in Iceland, I was doing lots of travel. I continued writing for that magazine. And I started writing for other magazines and online blogs and stuff. And I developed a really big speciality in Iceland. So much so that earlier this year, I published my own guidebook for intrepid travel about Iceland. And it's just kind of, it's become my full-time job being a travel journalist, and not just writing about Iceland now. I live in Spain. I write about Spain. I've been working on guidebook projects to different cities, different regions around this country, as well as all the stuff that I still do for Iceland. I've been lucky enough I've been paid to travel around Europe to different cities, cover different destinations for in-flight magazines, online magazines, guidebooks. I've also dabbled a lot in copywriting for travel businesses, tourism businesses, kind of writing descriptions for hotels or writing content campaigns for a brand or, stuff like that, writing tour descriptions. What else do I do? My career has kind of branched out into many, many different things, including teaching in this course. I design custom itineraries for people who want to travel in Iceland via camper van. And yeah, so I've had a pretty rewarding career in the world of travel journalism, I would say. And I'm kind of, continuing to explore it and, discover new ways, discover new paths where it can take me. And it's a really fun career and a really fun job to be in. So that's a little bit about me. And today I'm just going to be introducing the world of travel journalism, talking a little bit about the current landscape. What is travel journalism? Where are the places you can work, the kind of things you can publish, what does an average day working in the life of a travel journalist look like, stuff like that. There's a dedicated Q&A, little 10, 15 minutes towards the end of the class, but if you guys have questions during There's a little raise hand function that you can use on Zoom. So feel free to do that. Jump in if you have any questions that can't wait until the end. I'm happy to answer them and talk about them. But let's dive in, shall we? If I can get the slide to work. Okay. So what is travel journalism? For me, the most simple way to describe it, to define it, it's storytelling about people, places, and experiences. So it connects an audience with the wider world, and that can be through a written article, it can be through a podcast, a video, even like a short Instagram or TikTok. All of these things, just telling stories and connecting people. Historically, it has been rooted in the world of print, magazines. It started out in newspapers, guidebooks. They're still a big part of the landscape today, but that landscape has gotten much bigger with the influx of digital mediums like travel blogs. There's branded content for tourism operators, YouTube series, podcasts. There's the Instagram and the TikTok influencers who can go on to host their own TV shows for Nat Geo. And there's also it's all just storytelling, just through different mediums. And there's also like the rise of newsletters like Substack, where travel journalists can connect directly to their own audience. And of course, it's not all storytelling. There are some service pieces like guidebooks. It's like practical information, the nuts and bolts of a destination. There are those articles, here are the best hotels in Athens, for example, or Malta. So it's not always about a story. Travel journalism can veer into what I like to call the travel writing world, where you're just writing about travel. It doesn't have to have that journalism bent to it. And of course, it's more than just writing. It includes photography, editing. You can be commissioning travel articles. You can be directing a creative vision for a big project. So it's a very broad industry. And nowadays, travel journalists don't just work within one medium. We kind of spread out across several different mediums, like I do, designing itineraries, writing articles, working on guidebooks, teaching. It's all connected, and it's the best way to work in the world of travel journalism nowadays. Next slide. Sorry, I'm just kind of moving between my notes and the PowerPoint. Whoops. So here we have some of the different types of travel content. I'm sure you guys are all familiar with this kind of stuff. Online travel articles, websites like Afar. There's a print screen of an article from Afar there. Nat Geo Traveler magazine is one of the most famous travel magazines in the world. Travel books, these are like narrative travel books that you can read. Paul Theroux there, he's one of my favorite authors, and of course the Lonely Planet guides, TV shows. Anthony Bourdain, Parts Unknown, it's one of the most famous travel TV shows. Online travel blogs, Instagram, YouTube, TikTok, podcasts. So the landscape today. Is there a question in the chat? No. So what does the landscape of travel journalism look like today? The pandemic, it was, of course, a big turning point in the world of not just travel journalism, but just travel in general with the lockdowns, um, people not being able to travel. I'm not sure if you all know it, but at this point there was a lot of travel magazines that went out of business. Lonely Planet, they had to shut their big office in, I think it was Melbourne, or it might have been London. Um, so a lot of these famous travel publications during the pandemic were closing, they were cutting back people. The industry really felt like it was kind of almost dying, which was a bit scary to be working at that time. But since then, there's been quite a healthy recovery. Um, Although, like what we've recovered to, it's a little bit different to where we were just before the pandemic. So, of course, like I just mentioned, some of those traditional publications shut down, but there are still plenty of others that have remained strong, like Nat Geo Traveler, Condé Nast, Afar. All of these kind of survived, and some of them even thrived in the pandemic. And then also at the same time, a lot of independent travel magazines. I don't know if you guys know, but there are publications like Sidetracked, Lodestar's Anthology, Suitcase Magazine. All of these kind of niche travel magazines are really thriving. They publish less often, but when they do publish, it's very high quality work, beautiful design, beautiful photographs. The content kind of almost feels like a collectible. That's just one way print has survived. Guidebooks shifting focus after the pandemic. So before the pandemic, guidebooks were still doing quite well, even with the rise of social media and online blogs. They were kind of eating into the audience a little bit, but guidebooks were still doing quite well. And I wanted to talk a little bit more about the guidebooks in a little second. And then on the digital side, this is where things have really exploded in the past 5 years. Branded content, tourism boards, airlines, travel companies are commissioning journalists to create storytelling campaigns, written photos, videos, more often than not all together. And it's become a major source of work. And of course, all the opportunities that come through social media, which are a lot. Yeah. For some journalists, I think it felt a bit like a competition at the beginning. All of a sudden, anyone with a camera phone could record something, put it out on TikTok or Instagram, and kind of, almost snatch our audience for the traditional travel publications. But it's definitely just a tool that we can use, whether it's building an audience for other work or just using it to tell your own stories. It's definitely a part of the ecosystem today. Can't mention the landscape today without not talking about AI written travel blogs. That's a big thing that has kind of taken over a lot of online blogs lately, which is a bit scary, but it's very generic, and it kind of also at the same time makes the human voices and like authentic content far more important. And so yeah, it's that the landscape is shifting, but definitely still loads and loads and loads of work out there. I wanted to also talk a little bit. I will admit, I took this idea for a slide from one of my colleagues who did something similar, the decline of print magazines, and he had posted all of these cool travel magazines that are thriving nowadays. I think for the past decade, it's felt like everyone has been saying, oh, print is dying, like magazines, newspapers are dying. There's no work anymore. But that's just simply untrue. I think there's loads and loads and loads of opportunities to get published in the traditional travel magazines. I think there's always going to be a bit of a demand for physical media. There's nothing quite like the feeling of seeing your work being published in one of these glossy travel magazines. And for readers, I think there's something comforting about actually having something to kind of to hold and to look at and to revisit. And it's also important to note that these print magazines, they also have like a very high editorial authority. They have editors working there, fact-checking everything. They have a team that can do the work that random online sources aren't doing. And the death of the guidebook. No, these aren't dying. Even though I do a lot of work for Guidebooks. I work with Brat and DK, both out of the UK. I do a lot of work for both of these publishers on their guidebooks, and these are far from dying, even though you would maybe think the opposite. But there's been a big shift in how guidebooks operate after the online world came out and everyone was posting restaurants and hotels. Lonely Planet, for example, they kind of realized that they needed less information about hotels and restaurants. People are just going to go online for that, and they have an opportunity to throw in more authoritative experiences for a destination. And so these books are very practical. The book never runs out of battery. You can use it offline. You can browse it. It's really easy to browse. You can fold the corners down. You can scribble in the margins. You can. It's very useful on the ground. I would say online research is still the main way to do things before a trip, but then on the ground, I think guidebooks are really useful. And yeah, like I mentioned, the adaptation, the Lonely Planet have redesigned their formats. It almost feels like, I don't know if anyone has picked one up lately, but it almost feels like kind of flipping through like an Instagram reel or something. They have gone very heavy on photos, and they've got essays in there about different parts of the culture that the guidebook is focusing on. Rick Steve, famous guidebook author, his guidebooks are very dense. They're very information heavy. They've kind of, the publisher has switched. They've released shorter versions of those guidebooks, just kind of rounding up the highlights, including photos. And so they've kind of captured a whole new audience through that adaptation. And yes, so I was quite surprised actually to read that the sales of guidebooks is almost at the same point it was before the pandemic. So they're selling quite a lot. And yeah, I think also the value, authenticity, and curation. So online info, there's so much of it. A guidebook can just kind of condense it. Like I said, that there's a team of editors, a team of writers working on this, going through everything, and just kind of distilling the most useful information into one place. So the more there's so much noise online, and a curated guide becomes very valuable. I think that's my main point. The work of a travel journalist. So I just also wanted to talk about the day-to-day life of being a travel journalist. I can tell you just these past weeks, I've been working on a lot of guidebooks. I've been a bit strapped to my desk, updating some guidebooks to northern Spain. But before that, I was doing some trips in the mountains, research, And over the summer, I was, doing a big multi-day hike in Iceland for a story that's coming out soon. And yeah, it kind of the working life of a travel journalist changes a lot. So for this slide, I just kind of wanted to imagine that I have been commissioned some kind of article to write. I'm going somewhere, and these would be the stages that I go through. So before the trip, research, pitching, well, not pitching, excuse me, I've already pitched, I've already been commissioned, and planning. So research, it's essentially a whole lot of reading reading articles about the destination that I'm going, what has been covered, what hasn't been covered, what's the history of the place. If I need to file photos, for an article, I'll also look at the kind of pictures that have been published. And most often or not, I'll get together a little inspirational folder on Instagram where I save some photos that I think I might want to take, similar shots, or what's worked, what I think hasn't worked. Planning, I'm a big Google Maps man. I travel pin, I put pins everywhere, all the restaurants that might get mentioned in an online blog. Some have some buzz, I'll pin it. The main places I'm going to go to write about, I'll pin them down. And usually with a commission, there'll be some kind of mission that you have. So it kind of becomes easier to focus on what you're going to be looking at. For example, you might have a commission to go to Prague and write about the beer scene or the beer spa scene. So it'll be like, okay, what are the famous bars? Like, what are the breweries? Where are the beer spas at? All that kind of thing. During the trip, this is the hardest part of getting an article together. Observing, interviewing, sensory detail. I'm going to go a lot more into the sensory detail part in a little bit because that's my favorite. Observing is so important. Note-taking is kind of difficult. For example, if you're a tourist, you might just jot down in your travel journal, lovely view at this cathedral. But a journalist might write something like, two kids kicking a football in front of the cathedral, smell of frying garlic in the plaza, lottery numbers are being called out from a megaphone strapped on top of an old car. The notes need to go into much more detail about what you're seeing, what you're hearing, what you're observing, basically. Because when you go back to write your story or create your piece of work, it's those little details that will really bring it to life. Interviewing, this is another tricky part. Interviewing people, just getting quotes, it's also a really, really great way to bring a story to life. Why would I write about, provide some quick historical context on a place when I can just get a quote from somebody who lives there? It's immediately much more authoritative, and it also helps to bring stories to life as well. And it's just nice to go out and to talk to people a lot of the time. After the trip, this is when you're producing your piece of journalism, whatever it may be, an article, a video, a series of essays, whatever. So this is when you'll be tied to your desk, like I have been for these past couple of weeks, getting it done, writing it, editing it, putting together photos if they're included, editing together a video, packaging it all up. Make sure that if you have a commission, that you're hitting the points of the brief that the editor gave you. It's a lot of work oftentimes. And the skills that are most important, I find, curiosity, just being curious about people, about their experiences, asking follow-up questions. It can be hard if you're a little bit introverted, like I am, but it's really rewarding as well, kind of getting out of your shell and talking to people that you might not normally talk to. Adaptability, I think that's a given. If you're just traveling, not even for work, if you're just traveling, being adaptable is great. And storytelling, so which we will learn more about with David probably tomorrow in his open day. So like I said, I wanted to take a bit more of a dig into the sensory details, because this is what I love about travel writing. These descriptions of the details, they kind of tell a reader more than just what the place looks like. It conveys much more of an atmosphere, the mood of a place, its uniqueness, and the emotional impact it has on you as a journalist. So when we write about things like sight, sound, smell, taste, touch/texture, it often taps into something deeper. Readers can connect with these details because it evokes their own feelings and their own memories. A single line, it could be about the smell of wood smoke or the crunch of gravel underfoot. It can really help transport a reader into your story, even if they've never been to that exact place. I pulled out a nice excerpt from an article that I read. I'm going to read it out for you guys. The first bear, or rather its ghostly heat signature, appears almost as soon as we start looking through the thermal binoculars. It's before dawn, and we've pulled up to the crash barrier on a high and lonely road above the Junqueras River Valley. Without the expensive piece of kit, nature guide Jose Garcia Gonzalez tells me we'd never be able to see these creatures in the dark. But there one is, visible through the high-tech lenses, a brown bear showing white against the black of the steep mountain slope opposite us. As the sun comes up, we no longer need electronic wizardry to make out the scene before us. A primeval forest of oak and chestnut, broken by grass and scree, rising towards peaks cloaked by low cloud. From somewhere up there, we hear a wolf howl. I gasp, and Garcia holds a finger up to quiet me, then points in the direction of an answering howl, then another, and another. So you guys notice how it's not saying just like we saw a bear and heard wolves, which is great. Instead, it's kind of really leaning into the whole scene, the time of it, how it felt, what it sounded like for the writer in that moment. The ghostly white bear through the thermal binoculars, the primeval forest, the wolf howls kind of building towards the end of there. All of these like little details really pull you in to the story, and so you really feel almost as if you're standing on the mountainside alongside the writer. This is also the introduction for the story, which is it's one of the most popular ways to start a story, is to throw the reader right into the middle of the action. Pull them into the story immediately with an exciting scene with like lots of sensory details. Does anyone have any questions so far? I'm kind of breezing through this presentation. So, why does travel journalism matter? In an age when anyone can post a travel video, Viviana, sorry, you have a question?
Yeah, actually, you said if we had questions, there are actually many questions while you were speaking that came to my mind. But one of them is you mentioned in sensory, talking about this, the feel of the place is important. But how's that compared to when you were a travel writer? You talked about the guidebooks being dead, but yet, from my experience, I don't know if the redhead had it. A lot of people are now tailoring their trips with AI, which obviously doesn't give you that um, information that you're just talking about, like the visuals, the smells, the noises. How are you seeing that now that we're in the middle of this AI craziness for future writers? I imagine that the AI cannot actually write this sensory topics, but most people don't seem to care. Like this, the audience, do they care about this when they plan their trip, let's say to Iceland? How's that? How do you see that now with how the world is preparing their trips?
Okay, definitely. Yeah, with preparing trips and doing your initial research for a trip, it's, I would say, very different to a piece of travel journalism, just because it's more about the practical nuts and bolts of how you should go about traveling in a place, right? And I think there are two very different audiences. Those people using AI to plan their trips, whereas other people reading these travel articles published on reputable websites. Um, these are two very different audiences, I think. And yeah, so that answered your question, Viviana. Do you have a follow-up?
Yeah, I'm actually with your presentation. Go on. I don't want to keep interrupting you, but
No,
I
please.
think it would be interesting to know who is the audience, right? When you're a travel writer, most people think of so while you're talking, I can imagine exactly where like I can picture things or pieces that I have read where it describes exactly what you're just mentioning. But when you talk to the commoner who is just not pretty much into traveling as having that as a job, but more like I just want to spend 14 days of my life in this place and I want to get informed. This sensory things are more like things that they don't care about. So you're talking about audiences, and I want to explore more about these audiences because most travel writers think, okay, I'm going to write to the future person who's going to travel to X country or city or place or region,
Yeah,
and they just want the practicity. They just want to know what's the good hotel or what's the good spot to camp or what's the good
exactly.
restaurant to eat. So
Yeah,
maybe it's interesting to read about um this that I repeat again, what were your impressions, whether some people think is interesting to read that or not. Who are these people? Because some people might say, I don't want to read that. I don't want to be contaminated by the perception of somebody who already been there. I want to get my own, let's say, my own
yeah,
perception.
yeah, okay.
So maybe it's to question all this to say, who are we going to write to or inform this to?
Yeah, I definitely will say it's like the audience is people who are far, far more curious about a place. For example, that excerpt that I just shared about the bears and the wolves, that's a piece from Nat Geo Traveler about hiking in the Picos de Europa, here in Asturias in Spain. Um, I think those kind of, yeah, you're right. Those little sensory details, they don't matter for someone who's just planning a trip, who just wants to know, who just wants to kind of maybe find out where they should go and then form their own opinions of a place. Um, so that goes back to the different kinds of articles. There's the storytelling articles, and then there's the more kind of service orientated articles. And that's where the guidebooks come in. I can tell you with the guidebook work that I do, there's none of this sensory detail that goes into it. This is more for the kind of big feature articles that you might write for a website or a book, or not a book, sorry, yeah, a magazine. Um, so yeah, there's definitely two different audiences. That audience does exist. I mean, the magazines are still in business. These nice websites where you can read really, really good travel journalism are still in business. So there's definitely an audience for it. And I would say that these people are just far more curious and like want a little bit more context about the place where they're thinking of going. And they want like a little bit, they want to read a quote from a local. They want to, yeah, they want to kind of dig a bit more under the surface before they go, but still form their own impressions. This is just one moment in this destination. They could have a completely different experience. Yeah, I think I'm just rambling now. Has that kind of touched on what you were talking about, Viviana?
Yes, this is probably something I'll look later, or we can
Yeah,
talk later about it, but I will be interested to know this different kind of audience.
yeah, for sure. Thanks for the question. So why it matters? Where was that? So cultural translation. This is a big part of it. It's not if we're not working on like a service orientated piece. A piece of journalism is it's not just a list of places to go. It's kind of to bring, like I was just talking about, context, nuance, and some meaning to the place that we're writing about. So the journalist is interpreting, the culture, the history, and everyday life in ways that kind of helps a reader understand a place, yeah, under the surface, a bit more under the surface. It goes deeper than a lot of online content does. If you imagine like a short Instagram reel of for example, the Picos de Europa, it was just stitch together some video shots, have a narration. Sure, that's really cool, and it can provide some good information, but an article like the one that my example, is like a lot deeper. It spans several days. The writer's there spending time with someone, a local, guiding them around, providing like unique quotes that you won't get anywhere else. And, just kind of really painting a lovely picture of a destination. So yeah, travel journalism, pieces of work that should be grounded in research, lived in experience, that should be accurate as well. So it's curated by someone who has visited, kind of working as a travel journalist. They're there on a mission. Inspires and informs. Yeah, inspiration. It's creative work. I don't think it needs kind of a lot of reasons to exist. This creative journalistic work. We write about things because we want to write about them. They're interesting to us. They might be interesting to other people as well. But with that, there's like a sense of responsibility as well. Often the way that we write or work shapes how people might travel. It might shape how they see a destination, how they behave when they're there. So there's like an element of responsibility there. And good travel journalism can inspire curiosity about a destination, can inspire empathy and respect, and guide people towards a more sustainable kind of form of travel in that place as well.